There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamamia podcast.
Mamamia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on.
Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander listeners are advised that this episode contains the names of people who have died. It also deals with discussions of suicide, extreme violence and domestic violence. It's September 18, 2021, and Teresa Newchurch gets a text message from her sister. "I hate this. Literally the saddest shit ever," it reads. Teresa is at home in Adelaide, but her sister Charlene Warrior is 90 minutes away in a town called Butte. She's there to collect her 1-year-old daughter from her ex-partner, but this isn't the first sign of distress she's sent her sister. Earlier that evening, she'd called from a park bench in town, crying. "I need to get back to Adelaide," she said down the line through sobs. The next day, after the frantic call and the distressed text, there was silence. Not a text, not a call, nothing. Worried, Teresa messages the ex. He replies a day later, telling her he woke up and Charlene was gone. 15 days pass. Nothing. Then, on October 3, Charlene's body is found by a local man who's out for a walk. She's only 100 metres from the house in which she'd been staying. She is 200 metres from where authorities had launched their search for her. Within 24 hours, the police rule that the 21-year-old died by suicide, but her family don't agree. There are too many red flags, there are too many unanswered questions, too many contradicting stories. They say the police rushed their investigation, that they barely did an investigation. And 2 years on, they're still fighting for answers. They're not the only ones. Across the country, countless Indigenous families are begging the police to do more. They say they are the victims of a racist system, a system that is so entrenched with bias it can't even see the harm it's doing. I'm Gemma Barth, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamamia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. In August 2022, the Australian Senate announced an inquiry into missing and murdered First Nations women and children, the results of which will be reported in June 2024. Murder rates for Indigenous women are 8 times higher than for their non-Indigenous counterparts. They are 11 times more likely to die due to an assault, and they are 32 times more likely to be hospitalised due to family violence. The inquiry hopes to investigate what we can change to better address violence against this community. But today's guest's investigation goes deeper than the violence itself. It looks at what happens next. What happens after an Indigenous woman is found dead or murdered? How are circumstances that appear suspicious to the families involved quickly ruled as suicides with very minimal investigation? And why are loved ones being dismissed time and time again as they try to push for more information, more inquiry into the deaths of women in their communities? Douglas Smith is an Indigenous man himself. He is also the Indigenous Affairs reporter for the Adelaide Advertiser. And he and a team of reporters have been investigating the deaths of 6 Indigenous women from 3 different states. He joins me now. Doug, tell me about Charlene Warrior. Who was she as a person?
I mean, at first I didn't know her myself, but I came across her story as it was being reported, and there were posts on Facebook, and I knew that there was some connection there, but I wasn't quite sure what it was. So my dad rang me up and told me that he grew up with Charlene's father, like brothers. So they've known each other a long time. I didn't know Charlene personally, but after finding out that our fathers had grown up together after she passed away, I got to learn a lot about her. She was a young mother, 21 years of age, loved her family, loved her daughter. She was in a domestic violence relationship. When I speak to her family about who she was, she loved her netball. She was like her mother, Auntie Alma is her name. And, she was like her mum, loved her netball, loved her family, loved her country, where she's from, Narunga, loved all of her cousins. She was one of the kids growing up from Point Pearce. That's the mission out there on the York Peninsula or Narunga country. Growing up out there, and, she was very well known by her relatives out that way. And as she was getting older, she became a young mum, and then she turned into this loving, caring mother. She'd always put her daughter first, and that was the whole reason why she'd gone to Butte. But, yeah, from what her family tell me, she was a kind, gentle soul and loved her family very much, and especially her daughter.
Can you paint the picture of what Butte itself is like for those of us who haven't been there? What's it like as a town?
As you drive into Butte, I've been through a few times myself. We never really pull up there. I think the only time I've actually pulled up in Butte is when I went there with Charlene's family to revisit the place. It's a small town. There's not a lot going on. People usually drive straight through it. It's on grain farming country. Houses are pretty old and stone, and it's just a real quiet little town. There's not a lot going on there. I don't know any First Nations people that live there. The people from that country don't know any First Nations people that live there. As you come in there, you're driving in from the Adelaide side. You come down this main street. There's an old railway tracks. I don't think there's any train that goes through there anymore. There's one shop, looks like one pub. As you drive through it, there's really no one walking around the streets. You can see other people driving through to get to the next place. It's not somewhere where I don't think people would want to go there for a holiday or anything like that.
Not really a destination, so to speak.
No, it's a small little town, probably about 200-300 people.
Yeah, right.
It's just farming, yeah.
Sounds like the kind of place where you know everyone, like, your neighbours, the shopkeeper, everyone.
Yes, that's exactly what it is. And I think that's the barriers that we came up against, is that getting people to talk to us from that town, they were a bit hesitant, or they didn't want to, just because everyone knows everyone. And if you speak out about it, then, they're going to know that you spoke out about it. And it's like, yeah, it's just one of those small little towns where everyone's business, or, what do they call it? Small town syndrome.
Yep.
Everyone knows everything about everyone, and yeah, it's a small town, but it's tight-knit and people keep it themselves.
So to tell the listeners a bit more about what happened, Charlene, as you mentioned, travelled to Butte in September 2021 to pick up her daughter from her daughter's father, her ex-partner. Did she have much contact with her family during that time that she was in Butte?
Yeah, she did, actually. So her and her ex-partner, they was in a rough kind of relationship, but doing shared custody at the time. And she'd gone to Butte, I think it was September the 10th, to pick up her daughter. And she told her mum and her father that she was going there and she was going to go pick up her baby and bring her baby back to Adelaide. And mum and dad, Auntie Alma and Uncle Kent, they were loving grandparents. They are. They're like, go get her, bring her back. We want her back here now, because she'd gone there to stay with this ex-partner of hers. My understanding is that she took her daughter there so that the ex-partner could spend some time with the baby. And so she's gone there, and she'd had contact with her sister Teresa. They were best friends, inseparable, them two. And they grew up together. They knew everything about each other. And Teresa's the one that was messaging Charlene while she was there, just talking to her. And as she was in contact with Teresa, she's saying, he's not going to let me take baby home. I don't know what to do. So something started going terribly wrong while Charlene was in Butte. And by the sounds, and I've read the text messages, so once she got there, he didn't want to let baby go. She was okay to go by herself, but this person didn't want his baby to go back to Adelaide. Charlene, she was very upset about that. And she kept telling her family who were back in Adelaide, like, look, he's not letting me leave. He's not letting me leave with baby. What do I do? I need someone. So she was screaming out for help, for someone to come and pick her up.
Mm.
And the family, they don't have a lot of money, and they don't have transport or anything like that. There's no car back then. and they couldn't just get in the car and drive there and pick her up. Otherwise, they would have. So they were, ringing around a family to try and help her. And somehow even local CFS, this is maybe a day or two before she actually even gone missing, she was in the town and they must have had some sort of argument, and there were local people running around the town looking for her because they heard that there was a young mother in a bit of a situation. And so there was this local CFS volunteers who were, and we'd only found this out after we'd actually recorded the podcast, that there was, locals that were going around looking for her, like we're trying to find her. And this is before she was actually reported missing as well. And so on the 18th of September 2021, the last message that she sent to her sister, or last time she spoke to her sister, she was in a park around 8 o'clock at night crying on a FaceTime video call through Facebook Messenger. And she was crying, she was screaming, she was in hysterics saying, look, I need to get out of here, I need to get daughter and go. And she asked her family if they would be able to do a night trip to Adelaide to pick her up and basically run away with daughter. And that was the last time any of her family had heard from her. It's likely that she passed away either around that night or it could have been the next day. It's hard to say, but likely that night because she wasn't seen after that.
Once she stopped responding to her sister and her family, what happened next? They obviously knew that she was in distress, so I'm imagining that they probably moved fairly quickly when they didn't hear from her. Did they travel up there? Did they contact the ex-partner? What were their next steps?
Yeah, so Teresa, the sister who was mainly in contact with Charlene, contacting the ex-partner, just saying, like, have you seen my sister? Where is she? And the ex-partner's, messaging back and saying, I don't know, I woke up and she was gone. Baby's here with me. For 2 days, they were messaging back and forth. He said that he'd taken a trip to the police station in the next town over. There's no cop shop in this town, that's how small it is, to report her missing or speak to the cops about her, which there's no record of. So on the 20th, last day her sister spoke to her on the phone was the 18th. 2 nights later, Sister Teresa, after going back and forth with the ex-partner, reports her missing to the South Australia Police over the phone, calls them up and says, look, my sister's missing. It's been 2 days. The last time I spoke to her, she was in a park crying. Something's terribly wrong. And, yeah, apparently the cops had actually gone around to the parents' house in Adelaide to speak to the family, but there's no record of that either. That's where it also gets a bit odd. Something's off. Yeah.
So when did the police or the search volunteers actually start looking for her in Butte?
9 days after, that's when the police said they first received their missing persons report. The family say that they reported her missing twice, and the first time was on the 20th, 2 days after, because it makes no sense after a phone call with a loved one that's obviously in a bit of a situation crying for you to report her missing 9 days after. It just makes no sense. And that's where the police say that they didn't receive a missing persons report on the 20th. And then there was apparently another missing persons report made 2 or 3 days later by the family where they went into the Port Adelaide police station. Instead of over the phone, they've gone in there and said, our daughter's missing. This is the parents saying, our daughter's missing. Can you please do something about her? The police must have noted it down, but I don't think they actually took the missing persons report seriously because they didn't actually say that they received a missing persons report until the 29th. And then they didn't start searching for her until the 1st of October. So 29th, I think, maybe it was 2 days after the missing persons report that the SA police say that they got was on the 29th. They didn't start searching till the 1st of October, and then she was found on the 3rd of October. Not by the police or the SES or the CFS, just by a local who just happened to be taking a walk that day in the afternoon and just looked to his left and spotted her in plain sight.
Doug, can you tell us, and I know it's probably hard to go over this again, but can you tell us how Charlene's body was found?
Yeah. In Butte, basically where they launched the search from is a CFS shed, that's the Country Fire Service, and that's in the centre of the town just about. Like, if you put it on a map, it looks dead centre of the town. That's the staging point for the search. Where Charlene's body was found was about 150 metres from that, across the road, in a tree that was half hanging over a paddock and half hanging over someone's front yard. So Where she was found, I could almost throw a stone from the CFS shed and hit that tree. And it was in plain sight, like you can see it. Back then, maybe there were some branches and whatnot that would have maybe just sort of made it harder for them to see her. But where she was found, so she was found on the 3rd of October by a local. Get this, like, you know, the police and the emergency services had been searching for her. They had a helicopter up there. They had mounted horse. They had everyone looking for it was all over the news, but they couldn't see her. But this person who just was walking in the afternoon saw her, and it's like he wasn't even looking for her. So either she's just too obvious and in plain sight, or, yeah, I don't know, the family think that she wasn't there.
So the family think that she was probably placed there later.
That's what they think, because the police didn't take their first 2 missing persons reports serious. They didn't note them down when they should have. I've seen evidence that shows that they made a missing persons report before the 24th. So the police didn't actually take those missing persons reports serious. So the way the police have handled this makes the family not believe anything that they say, because they didn't take the family seriously. So when the police say that, yeah, she'd been hanging there the entire time, she was hanging in a tree, and apparently she'd hung herself with her pants. So the way that she was found in this tree, and apparently she'd been there for 2 weeks, and the whole reason that the police didn't look in that tree, they say, is because there were dogs in the yard next to it and didn't want to disturb the dogs. The police said that that's the whole reason they didn't search that tree. And it's the most obvious tree. Like, if you're standing in Butte, like, it's one of the most obvious spots. If someone had, killed themselves there, I don't see how that they can't spot that.
So the police, they deemed her death not suspicious. They said that she died by suicide, within 24 hours of her being found.
Yep.
That's what their story was. Had there been any investigation before that was decided that you guys found in your searches? Did they ask the family? Did they interview the ex? Was there any of that kind of stuff done?
So the family have told us that no, that they didn't, and they only spoke to the sister. The police say that they had spoken to the mother and the father, but it's the family against the police here. The police are saying that they've done all these things, but the family say that they didn't. The family say that they hadn't spoken to them, only the sister. And then when Major Crime got involved in it, I think that's when they'd spoken to the mother and the father. That's what we got from the police report that we got after making many, many inquiries into this matter. We got it from the family, and it said that the police had interviewed the mum, had interviewed the dad. I'd gone back and I'd asked the mother and the father, and they said no, they didn't. They only spoke to Teresa, and that's the sister. And then the ex, I can't say exactly how much they interviewed him, because there is a bit of hearsay here and there. Like, there are people that spoken to the ex, and he told them that, no, the police didn't really ask her that many questions. They asked her where she was, when did I last see her, and when did she leave. And he said that he told the police that he woke up and she was gone. Once they found her, her body was removed pretty quickly. And I've heard this from other reporters in Adelaide who were covering the story at the time, because once she was found, they drove back to Butte, which is only an hour from here. And, they were like, all right, a body's been found. So they drove back. And by the time that they got there, she'd already been removed from the tree. So she was removed from the tree on the same day that she was found, in the same afternoon. Yeah, I can't say exactly just how thorough of an investigation was forensically in terms of what they looked at the area. Yeah, and then after her death, they didn't actually interview the family. They never asked the family any questions about what was the relationship like between Charlene and her ex-partner. And in no way, shape or form am I saying that her ex-partner had anything to do with her death. But the fact is that the family don't feel reassured by that, because the police, in their eyes, have not done proper investigation. They haven't interviewed them after they found her body. They don't know that he's threatened her before. When I read the police report afterwards, it really made it seem like this was a depressed young Aboriginal girl who was a drug user, and she had reason to kill herself. I didn't see it that way. Sure, she, depressed. I mean, who's not? But she was trying to fight for her daughter. That was why she'd gone there in the first place, and not being able to get her daughter back, that's going to make anyone depressed really. But the way that the police put it is just like everything adds up to her killing herself because she was depressed, she was a drug user, her ex-partner and her ex-partner's father is also someone that is worth mentioning. He was being racist to her. And so she's copying it from the ex and her ex-partner's father as well at the same time. The whole thing itself is a mess because the police didn't take that first missing persons report seriously when they should have been out looking for her. There is a lot the SA police have done wrong in this case. I'll tell you that straight up. And I don't hate the police. I respect the police. I really want them to do their job properly. That's it at the end of the day.
You say that it's a mess and there's all these questions. Are you surprised by what's happened to this family as an Indigenous man yourself?
No, I'm not surprised. And I'm not saying that this doesn't happen to non-Indigenous families as well, and I know it does. It just happens to Indigenous families a lot of the time, a majority of the time, because statistically we are the most disadvantaged. We are, living in a more low socioeconomic way, more widespread. So when these types of things happen to Aboriginal people in their community, and when we try to seek help from the police around matters like this, we never really get it. And I've grown up, the same. And I'm not saying like deaths in my family, where there have been, but not to this extent. So there's no murder investigation going on. But if we're asking the police to do a simple thing, it's their job. They don't do it for Aboriginal people, not where I'm from anyways. I've never had that experience myself. I know a lot of Aboriginal families that have had that same experience as well. And for this family, it's not unique just to this family because you listen to the podcast itself, there's 6 other families going through the same thing. And it wasn't very hard to find the 6 families in this podcast because you throw a rock, you can almost, hit the front yard of one of these families. They're everywhere.
Yeah.
There are a lot of First Nations families experiencing this. And I know, and as I said before, I know there are a lot of non-Indigenous families experiencing this as well. And I've heard from a lot of them since releasing this podcast. Obviously, we're just focusing specifically on First Nations families here because the way that even the media reports on it itself is inaccurate a lot of the time, I believe. And the reason I got into journalism, the way that Indigenous families are reported on or Indigenous issues themselves are reported on by mainstream media, it's a lot of inaccuracies in the reporting. And it comes down to that, and then it comes down to the way that, these Indigenous families are also treated by authorities. So you cop it on all fronts in a way as a First Nations person. And for this family, I'm not surprised. No, I'm not surprised at all. I wouldn't be surprised if, this continues and there's no solution to it because I've sat in the Senate inquiries, and I listened to the head of the New South Wales Police talk about them not believing that racism is in the New South Wales Police Force or that they are doing all the right things by the First Nations communities that they serve across New South Wales, and couldn't name one Aboriginal person that worked in the homicide area of the New South Wales Police Force, not one Indigenous person. All they've got working for the New South Wales Police Force are Indigenous liaison officers. They think that that's enough to bridge the gap between the community and the police. It's just not. There needs to be more work done, but they're not too keen to listen to First Nations people on the issues. They don't listen to First Nations people when First Nations leaders tell them that they're getting it wrong, that they could be doing more and there could be a better relationship between the police and the community. But the police don't want to hear that. They want a police. That's all. They don't want to hear from Indigenous communities. Look, we think there might be a better way for us to work together so that, you can hear these voices, but, it never really happens. And I've seen the police disregard, when Indigenous leaders say that to them. They don't want to listen to them because they think they know the best, but they don't.
Doug, you mentioned that you wanted to become a journalist to kind of be able to tell First Nation stories and try to make a difference in this space. But before you started this bigger podcast investigation that we're talking about today, you actually were thinking about quitting the profession. The reasons that you've just been talking about, is that why?
Me personally, I've been doing this for 9, coming up to 10 years now. It's been amazing. I love this job. I'm very passionate about this job, but it's just all for me. It's all just been bad reporting. Like it's always something negative. Like look at the happy story here and there, but it's either deaths in custody every week, all week, or it's either going to another march because something has happened. And Charlene Warrior, when she first passed away, I was covering her story for NITV SBS, or it's Aboriginal people just fighting for a better say in things and seem to be getting nowhere most of the time. So, when you're constantly reporting on death and destruction of land and heritage, and it just seems to fall on deaf ears sometimes, you kind of do feel a bit burnt out. So, yeah, I was thinking about quitting for a bit there. But obviously, yeah, this new opportunity came about with the Advertiser, and I used to work with the Advertiser years ago. I loved it. One of the best places I've ever worked. I used to be an intern here when I first started, and coming back, I'd be in a senior role, be able to tell the stories I wanted to tell, and then be a part of the Dying Rose, podcast was massive draw card for me to come back. So, yeah, just being a part of the team, and I think what we have done, my two colleagues, Emily Ollie, Catherine Birmingham, then we've also got Dan Box over in Sydney and Jasper Leake who put this together, and my editor Gemma Jones. What we've been able to do with this is it's given me more reason to continue with my journalism, because I think these types of projects can make a difference, can have an impact rather than them falling on deaf ears.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Gemma Barth. I'm speaking with Indigenous Affairs reporter Douglas Smith about his research into a series of Indigenous deaths that expose an uncomfortable truth about how these cases are investigated. We're not going to go into all of the women's stories. They are unfortunately quite similar in nature. But I do want you to tell me a little bit more about LaSonia Dutton and what happened to her.
So, LaSonia Dutton, and I got this from another friend of mine, Diana Damjanovic, and me and her worked together at NITV. She called me up and said, look, this girl has been found dead in the backyard of her home in Wilcannia in central western New South Wales. So this girl's been found dead. She's 31. She's about 4 metres from the back door of her home. She was in a pretty bad state. She'd been laying there for 4 days and her body had just been decomposing. She went out one night, had a few drinks with some family members around the town, and then she told them, like, oh, I'm going to go home. See you all tomorrow. Love yous, blah, blah, blah. And then she walked off, and that was the last that they seen of her. And she wasn't seen for about, 4 days after that. Family were looking for her everywhere. And then apparently she just magically appeared in the backyard on the 4th day. She was in a domestic violence relationship as well. And I have been unable to speak to this person who she was with apparently on the night of her death, because this person is incarcerated. But I've spoken to this person's family, and it's a small town. I didn't want to speak too much about it, but they're just saying it's not what it is. He didn't do it. I said, okay, well, the family, they have a different story. And there's a bad relationship between the local police and that family. There's history there. And the family feel like the police have not listened to a word they've said because they don't like LaSonia's father. They've already arrested him a few times. He has bad blood with the police, but just because he has bad blood with the police, they didn't investigate his daughter's death properly. So it's now left up to him to do that, and that's what he's been doing since she passed away in March 2022. I went out there about 2 months after it happened. Me and my ex-colleague, Diana, we went out there and, we sat down with the family, and we quite couldn't believe it as well, because they said, no, we'd walked through this backyard multiple times over the weekend. She wasn't here. How does she pop up here on a Tuesday?
So I guess the common thread here for you guys investigating is you've got two women in different states, and you're seeing similarities in the way the police force is treating their deaths and what happened and the investigation around it. Is that right?
Absolutely, yeah.
And it comes back to that racial bias again.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a common thread among all 6 of these, and it is racial bias. And if you listen to episode 5, that wasn't even a murder. That was a suicide, according to the family. And the way that the police treated them on that, absolutely ridiculous. And I've seen the video footage of it. So as an Aboriginal person, when the police rock up to your house, it's never for a good reason. Like, they're either there to get you or they're there looking for someone who you don't even know sometimes, or you might know, or it might be extended family. Like, it's always, we're here to look for this person. For a lot of these communities like Wilcannia and Sejuna, where I'm from, that's how it is. That's a relationship between the police and the black community. There's a history of bad blood between the Indigenous community and the police. That's not been addressed. And that's why we see these investigations not getting the proper attention that they need. It's just not happening. Yeah, we don't expect them to. We don't call the police when there's something most of the time. Like, we don't call the police when we need their help because we don't expect them that they will help us. And especially in these cases, there's a common thread there. There's a distrust between the police and Indigenous families, but it's also racial biases in the way that just because they're black women, they've probably killed themselves. That's what it is for all these cases, except for episode 5, where it's a different story.
Yeah, so just to touch on that a little bit for the listeners, Shannara is the different story you're talking about in which she did die by suicide, but 5, is it riot police, turned up to arrest her brother, and there's audio from it. It's like a horrendous scene to hear.
Yeah, absolutely. So I went to Alice Springs to do a story about something, because obviously, look, Alice Springs, what we know of Alice Springs in the media is that there's a lot of antisocial behaviour and there are a lot of issues in Alice Springs, and we'll hear about it, right? And we know that there's a big police presence in Alice Springs, and we know that they have tactical response group, and we know what happened with Zach Rolfe and Kumanjay Walker. We know about all that. And so, the police there and the Aboriginal community, I mean, I don't live there, but I can just imagine, like, being a black fella living in Alice Springs and having to deal with the police. It would be, it's crazy. I wouldn't want to be in that position. For Shannara, Lena Rose Campbell, she woke up one morning. It was the 4th of October, 2019. She woke up in the morning. She heard screaming at the back of her door. And she got up and she ran to the door with her niece. And her niece had found Shannara Bright, that's Lena's daughter. She found her hanging on the clothesline. And, the mum, Lena Rose, she ran out. She was screaming. And her son, Justin, he must have heard his mum screaming. So he's come down and he's ran out the back. And he's looked out the back door. And then he sees his sister's hanging on the clothesline. So cuts her down. They take her inside and she's still warm. And they want to resuscitate her and bring her back to life. They call 000. They call for an ambulance. They're like, we need your help. We need medical help right now. And instead of the ambulance rocking up, 5 police officers from Alice Springs, NT Police, Northern Territory police officers, rocked up, forced their way into the house, arrested Justin, stepped over the body, didn't render any CPR, and it's just absolutely, like, harrowing. Like, that footage is just crazy. I was like, is this a movie? If this happened to a white family in a rich suburb in any of our cities, this would be all over the news. We know that. But when it's a black family in Alice Springs, this is swept under the rug, which it was. This was swept under the rug, completely swept under the rug. The police had to pay, like, I'm not even going to go into it, but they came to an agreement, because it was so wrong what they did, and the police acknowledged that. A private apology is what they got. So they ring the ambulance for help, and 5 police officers rock up, bash their son, and arrest him and drag him out, and then they charge him with to police, resist arrest, and assault police. Like, come on, what is that? I can't believe that.
Yeah.
Well, actually, I can, but other people, wow.
But I guess that story shows that's not just racial bias, that is racism in full flight, whereas these other stories, and I want to just mention the names of these other women that you talk about, Rose Hunter-Heberman, Lila Nettle and Charlie Powell, those 3 other stories are other instances alongside Charlene and LaSonia where police just don't really investigate. They just say they died by suicide when there are all these other clues that suggest perhaps something different happened. But with Shannara, it's kind of in your face. There's no ignoring it.
Legit. And that was it. They even charged him. That was 2 weeks before Kumanjay Walker got shot by Zach Rolfe out at Yuendamu. And the charges disappeared. He rocked up to court to go to court and he wasn't even on the list after they'd bashed him in his own house and stepped over his sister's dead body and dragged him out and left her there to die. Yeah, so it's in your face for sure. but no one had reported that before, only us.
So over the last 2 years, you've been investigating this story. You've been talking to these families. You've been trying to get their side of the story out there. Has there been any change, progress, answers for any of these families since you guys released your podcast and your work?
Yeah, we've got the New South Wales Coroner's Court have obtained or subpoenaed all of our material because they're looking at holding an inquest into LaSonia Dutton's death, and that's episode 2. And yeah, so we had to hand over all our material, interviews, correspondence, emails, texts, everything, which we did. We're happy to do that. So, we've gone out there and conducted the interviews that the police should have conducted. But that's the only one so far. We've just had a big wall of silence from the police, literally. It's always been that way with the police, especially here in South Australia. They don't want to talk about any of their past operations or past investigations or anything like that. They won't speak to us. The coroners won't speak to us here in South Australia. I've got a wall of silence from the NT Police. I've reached out to, Chanty Pace, the Aboriginal Affairs Minister up there. I've reached out to the Police Minister. I've reached out to the ministers in the NT over Shannara Bride. They wouldn't comment on it at all. They said, no, we don't comment on police matters. So the police minister doesn't comment on police matters? I don't get that. And then I went to the police and they won't comment. So we're not getting anything back from the police. They don't want to talk about there's gaps. They just believe that they've done everything by the book, everything right, and there's nothing to see here. That's for everything.
It makes you go, well, how do we change this? What do we do? What's the difference? And I think it's worth pointing to, and you guys do this in your podcast too, the Voice referendum result, because that's still fresh in our minds. That was last week. Australia voted no. Do you feel comfortable articulating how that decision affects the women and the families in these stories in particular? Because ultimately that vote was about listening to Indigenous peoples, wasn't it?
Yeah. That was a beam of hope, I guess, the Voice you could say, because these voices have not been heard. These families, their voices are not being heard. I guess the way a no vote would affect is we're not going to hear from them. I mean, their voices are not going to be heard, only if there's media attention. But that's the only way I can see it. Or if, somehow these communities become more empowered, which they need to be.
And I guess the Voice would have helped that.
Yeah, I believe it would have. Yeah, I voted yes. I'll say that right here. I did vote yes because I believe it would have made, a difference. And I hoped it would have made a difference anyways. And that's all, you can do is hope. In that case, really, you can just hope that, this is going to hopefully make a difference. And hopefully these voices can be heard. But if it doesn't go through, then I don't see how. I guess me as a journalist, I can raise as much awareness. I am one Indigenous journalist. I have one other Indigenous journalist here at the Advertiser with me. We are the two only Indigenous journalists in the whole state of South Australia.
Oh, wow.
So there are no other Indigenous journalists here. And so we try to, if we can raise awareness about these stories and how, I guess other media should also approach these stories, just think about the bigger picture of missing and murdered First Nations women across Australia. The statistics themselves should tell you that they're more likely murdered. And obviously there is a high suicide rate in our community as well, but you can't write every single one off as suicide. There are statistics that say that, Indigenous women suffer at domestic violence more than anyone else in Australia. So that should tell them straight away that there might be something else here to investigate. The police should take that into account. There needs to be better training in the police forces in each state and territory around domestic violence.
Lastly, Doug, I just wanted to ask you, and this might be a big question, it might be too hard to answer, but for those listening who are, disgusted in what they're hearing, what can they do? How can they help? Is it just by amplifying these stories, talking about them, sharing them? What can we do?
Yeah, you just said it there, really, is talking about this and amplifying it and actually taking the time to understand, because I've had people say, this happens to white people too. I'm like, I know it does. I absolutely know it does. I never said it didn't. I just said that this happens to First Nations women a lot because we come from a background of disadvantage and we're starting behind the start point really in terms of we're trying to get our voices heard, but we can't because the relationship that we've got with the police, there are barriers already put up there. There's a big mistrust. The colour of your skin as a white person doesn't hold you back from having your voice heard as much as it is a non-Indigenous person when it comes to speaking to the police. They're automatically not going to listen to First Nations people most of the time, or think that, this is just how black people live. And sometimes they say when First Nations women go missing, they've just gone walkabout. That's absolute bullshit. They don't just go walkabout. Like, what are you talking about? I've heard that said before. Why would you even say that? They don't just go walkabout. Like, that's ridiculous. So there is a bad relationship between the police and the First Nations community in Australia, and that holds us back a lot more than it does for non-Indigenous people. So just think about that to the listeners, just think about, wow, like, there's history there. That history hasn't been addressed. The only way to push forward together is to address that history, have a truth-telling process, come to whatever it is, a conclusion or what, and push forward together. But no, we are going to sit in the past, because I guess the voice was a bit of a hope for it itself. But other than that, the police ain't listening to First Nations families. And in all these cases, they're not. And I don't see them actually trying to do anything to address that at all.
Thanks to Doug for assisting us to tell this story. You can learn more about his team's investigation, which has been nominated for a Walkley Award for Excellence in Journalism, at dyingrose.com.au. It's linked in our show notes if you'd like to take a look. True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast hosted and produced by me, Gemma Barth, with audio design by Scott Stronach. Our executive producer is Gia Moylan. Thanks so much for listening. I'll be back next week with another True Crime Conversation.